Shalom, this is the Beak back with another edification. I want to thank all of my subscribers. I want to wish all of my subscribers high health and high spirits. And I wish that all of my subscribers are safe and your loved ones are safe and protected against these agendas that are waged against us here behind enemy lines here in America. All right, I have been bothered by this thought of freedom, okay? And what I want to do is explain the difference between freedom and salvation, and I want to also point out how so-called blacks have never desired salvation or separation from so-called white America. So-called blacks have, I believe personally, so-called blacks fell in love with so-called whites during slavery. And then they became overly infatuated with so-called whites after so-called whites emancipated so-called blacks from forced bondage, okay? So there's this deep-seated affection that so-called blacks have for so-called whites that I don't have for so-called whites, all right? So-called blacks are the Israelites of the Bible. The Israelites of the Bible include the so-called Negroes and Latinos and Native Indians, okay? Those people over in Israel today who say they are Jews but are not the people of the book. They are the Ashkenazis, all right? Now, I want to get into this freedom thing versus salvation because it bothered me. Now, let's talk about freedom real quick. Freedom, all right? If you think you're free, you are dumb, okay? This is for anyone who expects the laws of white America not to apply to them, okay? Freedom is not just a thought, okay? You can't wake up telling yourself white America and their laws don't apply, all right? When that individual has not taken the proper steps to terminate the control that the so-called whites have over all adults and all children that are behind enemy lines here in America, okay? So-called whites control this place, and so-called whites create laws for the people, the citizens, to abide and obey, okay, and abide by. Now, freedom. Let's get into freedom, because so-called blacks, they want freedom so damn much. Let's talk about freedom. Freedom, Old English freedom, power of self-determination, state of free will. Free will. Free will is sin, all right? Repent from free will. This is what I explained in my previous video. Repent from free will. Free will is nothing more than permission to sin. That's all free will is. The heathens, the so-called whites especially, promote free will in their religious synagogues of Satan, okay? Heathens are not required to keep the laws of the Most High God, the laws of heaven. So I would only expect for the heathens to promote sin, okay? That's exactly what free will is. On my channel, I explain to the so-called blacks, Latinos, and Native Indians to repent from free will, all right? Free will is nothing more than sinning, okay? It says emancipation from slavery, emancipation, another word for freedom, which does not include separation or sovereignty or independence or salvation, okay? Deliverance, okay? Deliverance from, now the 14th Amendment says that slavery is abolished unless a person is convicted of a crime, and then they fall back into slavery. Now let's keep reading. It says meaning exemption from arbitrary or despotic control, civil liberty, okay? Freedom is a liberty, all right? It is a liberty, and liberties can be revoked or suspended or terminated. It says civil liberty is from late 14th century, meaning possession of particular privileges. Privileges can be revoked. During traffic stops here in America behind enemy lines, so-called blacks will say they know their rights. Well, you have no rights. You have privileges, okay? You have the right to bear arms, but you do not have the right to draw your weapon on a police officer and as if it's your right, okay? You don't have a right to point your gun at a police officer, okay? That's not a right. Now, you don't have no rights. You have privileges over here in Babylon. Let's keep going. It says, it has been said by some physicians that life is a forced state. The same may be said of freedom. It requires efforts. It presupposes mental and moral qualities of a higher order to be generally diffused in the society where it exists. Okay, that's just a bunch of words per minute. That don't mean nothing, all right? Freedom is another form of bondage because only so-called whites can offer freedom, all right? Freedom is another form of bondage because free individuals only exist as law-abiding citizens, okay? So that's not the same as salvation, okay? Now, let's get into salvation. It says, and I heard another voice. This is Revelations, okay? This is Revelations 18. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, meaning come out of the philosophies and the mentality of referring to yourself as an American. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins. All right, free will is sin. So-called whites and the rest of the non-Israelite races will continue to promote sin in the form of free will. All right. It says, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God have remembered her iniquities. So-called blacks, Latinos, and Native Indians are being punished in the form of death for their iniquities, their disobedience, for not being law keepers, okay? For not keeping the laws, statutes, and commandments of Yahweh, all right? They're being judged, and they're being deleted day in, day out. They're falling short, coming up short without the Most High, all right? Because the Most High is not with those individuals who do not keep the commandments and think disobedience is a choice or think free will is an option when it's not. Okay? Free will is disobedience. Now, let's get into this content real quick. Okay. Freedom. This freedom thing bothered me, and I don't like freedom. I like salvation. Freedom and salvation are total opposite. They're not friends. They're not the same, okay? Freedom is another form of, to me, it's another form of sin, okay? Because salvation is what the so-called blacks, Latinos, and Native Indians are told to strive for, salvation, which is separation, okay? That's why the Most High tells us to come out of her, my people, while freedom grants an individual certain privileges, not even rights, but privileges. All right? Privileges can be revoked, terminated, or suspended. All right? Started to bother me when I made my previous video, this freedom thing. Now, I'm a veteran, a military veteran. I served in the U.S. Marines. All right? And I was an amazing Marine. All right? Stayed dangerous, stayed successful. All right? Got along with all the devil dogs. Okay? What I'm saying is freedom is another form of bondage, because freedom can only be offered by the children of Satan, which are the so-called Edomites. That's freedom. Freedom comes with a form of control. All right? The Edomites have control over free people. Edomites control free people. Free people fall under the jurisdiction of so-called white control. This is why here in America, behind enemy lines, individuals which claim to be free and claim that they know their rights when it pertains to the authority and the control of white America, all right? White America occupies this territory. This is an occupied territory. It's under the forced control of so-called whites. I don't care if an individual claims to be a Moor. I don't care if they bumped their head and woke up out of a coma speaking a different language. They are not free from the jurisdiction and control of so-called white Americans, all right? That's why I don't listen to ideas. I don't like people who have the idea that they're going to wake up and decide that the laws of white America don't apply to them. You have to go through the courts to terminate that type of control, all right? So this subject bothered me to the point where I started to think about so-called black leaders. And I don't like so-called black leaders. I didn't like Martin Luther King. We call him Martin Luther Coon. I didn't like Messy Jesse, all right, Jesse Jackson. I didn't like none of them. I didn't like W.E.B. Du Bois. I didn't like none of them. I didn't like Madam C.J. Walker. Damn show ain't like her. She was stupid. She was doing she the reason why these modern day females look stupid today, altering their natural image. Madam C.J. Walker promoted skin lighteners and hair products, all right? So she was stupid to me too. She was nothing but a Western modern day unlawful female. Okay, she was stupid too. Who else? All of the black leaders were. Some of the ones that were trying to push for economics empowerment, I'll give them that. That was good, because at least they were trying to get their hands on some resources to better to empower the so-called black people. But the so-called black men were unsuccessful with those economic movements, because you had other so-called blacks who were integrating with so-called whites by any means necessary, even at the expense of destroying the so-called black family. So I don't like black leadership. They're foolish and they're stupid to me. Okay, Martin Luther King was stupid to me. Jesse Jackson was stupid to me. And in this video today, I want to talk about how stupid Harriett Tubman was, because she was stupid too. I didn't like her neither. I don't like none of these so-called blacks, because they always come up with the bright idea to go somewhere in the face of so-called whites and ask for freedom, okay? I watched this movie, the Harriett Tubman movie, just for this content. And just like I assumed, just like I predicted, just like I expected, this stupid female led whatever slaves up north to another group of white people. There's no historical record about when these slaves led themselves up north on the Underground Railroad from the abolitionist South. History doesn't say that when these so-called black slaves arrived up north, that there was some free things given to them in the form of a house, land, clothes, food, shelter, you name it. Nothing was free when these slaves arrived up north. Now in the movie, Harriet Tubman is crying. This is Harriet in the movie. She's looking in the direction that she needs to go in order to reach freedom. It's funny how freedom is just another group of whites. This is freedom for so-called blacks. Freedom is just another group of whites. That's freedom. It's a group of whites that don't want to tie so-called blacks to a tree and whip them and force bondage and all this kind of stuff, right? So-called blacks trust so-called whites that don't want to beat them. They trust them, all right? They're just like a dog with his tail between his legs. All you got to do is gain his trust, and these so-called blacks will start wagging their tail and acting all domesticated, okay? So here's Harriet. She's looking in the direction that she's told to go in for her freedom. And she's ready, but she's crying, but she's ready, okay? This is her, okay? This is her. Now, she wanted freedom to get away from the Southern whites. She wanted freedom. Now, she's stupid for going after freedom, okay? But this is all the whites were offering these so-called blacks back there. So she considered being up north and free was better than being down south, regarded as somebody's property, because she was the property of this guy. Okay, this guy is the son. He's the son of the slave owner. And he owned Harriet. So when Harriet would come up missing, this guy would be looking for her because he purchased Harriet. Now, Harriet, while she's trying to find her way up north to go towards freedom, which is another group of Edomites, whites who were offering paid labor. That's all she did was go up north to pay labor. While she did that, guess what happened to the Negroes, the so-called blacks who stayed on the plantation? See, the so-called black man that was the preacher, the plantation preacher, the one who was telling the slaves, obey your master, that was the Negro slave, plantation slave. He felt safe. He, the preacher, Jake, the so-called black man, he is the one who introduced the path up north to Harriet. He didn't even want to leave the plantation because he felt safe as a plantation preacher, something like a house nigga. He wasn't being beaten all the time, so he didn't want to leave. This is freedom, and he didn't want it. He didn't want freedom. All of the slaves on the plantation did not want freedom because freedom was just in the form of being around another group of whites. So the house nigga or the plantation preacher, he was being treated differently. He already had a set of privileges. And that's all freedom is privileges. Harriet wanted to run up north to some privileges while the plantation preacher, he was already being given some type of privileges as a plantation preacher. He didn't want to leave the plantation. He was doing quite well. in his right mind, this is what he was thinking, because he wasn't trying to leave. She was. Now, this black woman right here is an example of so-called blacks, Latinos, and Native Indians who prefer to be around so-called whites, because she didn't want to leave neither. He was accusing her of knowing about these runaway slaves. She didn't know nothing about it, but she was still not willing to leave. She didn't want to leave neither. All of the slaves on the plantation didn't want to leave the plantation. Okay? So she was trying to reassure this Edomite slave master, because he ain't nothing but a slave master. He's just the son of the original slave master. Okay? She was reassuring him that she didn't know nothing about the slaves trying to run away. I think he slapped her. He slapped this so-called black woman. He slapped her for staying. He slapped her for not knowing nothing about it. He slapped her because he don't trust her. So when he threatened her in this scene, he told her, when I get back, I'm going to deal with you. You know what that means, right? He got mad at her. She looked scared. He told her, when I get back, I'm going to deal with you. You know what that means. He ain't going to do nothing but have sex with her in the form of, unwanted sex, right? He going to do whatever to her, So I believe somewhere during slavery, so-called blacks fell in love with being oppressed and fell in love with their oppressors. So-called black people are in love with so-called whites. Okay, it's a twisted love that they got for these so-called whites because they don't want to separate. Okay, he told her, when I get back, I'm going to deal with you. Okay, now you know what that means, all right? Now, I know this looks blurry, but I'm going to ask you to read what it says at the bottom. It says, Bigger Long? Bigger Long is a so-called black slave catcher. It's a so-called black male slave catcher. The so-called slave master, or the so-called white man right here, that's him right here. You can see his hair in the top left with his hat, okay? Then you see this so-called black man that's offering the so-called white man his service. He's telling the so-called white man that I can track down your slaves for you, all right? And he's telling the so-called white man that he knows this so-called black man that's a slave catcher. His name is Bigger Long, okay? So the so-called white is asking him, oh, you know Bigger Long? And the so-called black is telling him, yeah, I know Bigger Long, okay? During slavery, so-called blacks were helping so-called whites capture so-called blacks. And they still do this today. That's why I don't like so-called blacks, because you have different so-called blacks that will either pretend to be neutral when there's no such thing as neutral because they'll be religious. And then you have these so-called blacks that like to offer their services to so-called whites in a form of treachery. Okay, they'll so-called whites love so-called blacks that want to bring more so-called blacks to the so-called whites. So Harriett Tubman was running back and forth up north, bringing more blacks to the north, to so-called whites. So they liked her. This so-called black man was bringing Esau more so-called blacks. Any individual that wants to show their allegiance to so-called whites in a form of betraying their own race, so-called whites will welcome that person. That's why I say we have to be very suspicious of any so-called black, Latino, Native American that so-called whites honor or love. Because usually this individual that so-called whites care about will backstab their own people to be an honorary member amongst these so-called whites. You can't trust them. That's why if you're a so-called black man, you've been pulled over by a so-called black officer and you try to refer to him as your brother, he gonna be like, I'm not your brother, okay? Because they gotta prove to these so-called whites that they're not down with you because you're their spiritual brother or whatever like that. They got to show their allegiance. Why so-called blacks that be in the hood, they know that so-called black cop is way more dangerous than the so-called white cops. All right, I digress, but let's keep going, all right? This is the hand of this so-called black male, so-called white man threw a little silver coin on the ground for the so-called black male offering his services. The so-called white man threw a little silver coin on the ground, and the so-called black man is reaching for it. Same thing with Judas. When Judas was given 33 shekels. Shekels is nothing but silver or gold, but this is a shekel. It had a certain weight on it. The silver or the gold, precious metal. But here it is in this movie. This so-called black man is telling the so-called white man that he'll offer his services to capture slaves. And the so-called white man tossed him a shekel. All right, so these so-called blacks in America, they ain't nothing but some damn lapdogs. They want to be all up in the face of so-called whites. They want to entertain them and make all these promises of being in alliance and being complicit with them, right? The Most High God is going to destroy these so-called blacks. He ain't dealing with them when they want to help the so-called whites make America great again, or, help make whites great again and all that kind of stuff, okay? So look, that's his hand picking up the shekel, okay? Let's keep going. So that's freedom, all right? When she gets up north to freedom, when Harriett Tubman reaches the north, she went to Philadelphia. She made it to Pennsylvania. When she got up there, all she did was get a job. I encourage anyone that's still listening to this content to go check out the movie. You can go check out the movie, the Harriett Tubman movie. You can probably find it online. Check out one of those websites that let you watch movies for free. I wouldn't pay to see the movie, but I would definitely try to find it on one of these websites that bootleg the movie and watch the movie for your own self. But I'm going to just wrap this up about when she made it up north. She made it up north to Philadelphia. The first person she bumped into was a so-called black man. He was a vendor. And this is a spoiler alert, okay? Spoiler alert, okay? She gets up north. She bumps into this vendor. Because there was no forced bondage, of course she gets up north. This is before EIN numbers, before you had to have a tax ID number. She just started noticing that these so-called blacks were street vendors, like selling fruits and stuff. Stuff that so-called blacks don't want to do today. We got these migrants being deported. Who's going to pick the crops? Who's going to be the street vendors? So-called blacks don't even want to be street vendors. That's why I was so stupid when they were saying that these so-called immigrants were stealing the jobs. Well, they're not stealing jobs. Unless y'all want to be street vendors. So-called blacks don't want to be street vendors. You don't see no blacks outside popularizing being a street vendor. Most of these so-called blacks want to work in offices. They don't want to work outside in no field or on the street being no vendor. They're not even good at being independent. So many so-called blacks are not good at being independent. They have to be dependent, so they got to go get them a job. This is what freedom is. Freedom is nothing more but labor. privileges. Harriett Tubman went up north, bumped into the street vendor. He tells her, you don't have to be afraid up here. You don't have to worry about, you know, being attacked. You know, and those so-called whites are going to try to harm you. He gives her an apple and tells her everything's going to be okay. You know, these whites up here are not. They're not like those whites down south, pretty much is what he was telling her. He gives her a point of contact because she was supposed to meet this guy that was pretty much accepting all the slaves and recording their names and taking record of these slaves coming from down south. Now, me personally, my people are up north in Ohio, right along the Underground Railroad. My people used to help the slaves along the Underground Railroad. This is why my DNA is kind of militant. I'm militant. I'm militant, or I'm a soldier. Okay, so my people are like me, militant, taking chances, like helping people along the Underground Railroad. Ain't afraid of no damn Edomites. Okay, so anyway, she bumps into the guy that she was supposed to come in contact with. He records her name. He introduces her to that artist, Janelle Monáe, whatever her name is. Janelle Monáe is the child of a so-called white man. Her mother was a bed wench, or a Eve, or a so-called black woman was the mother. And her mother was impregnated by a so-called white man, which produced Janelle Monáe in the movie. Janelle Monáe owned property. They tried to show these Negroes up north as if they possessed assets, but the assets were not earned. They were given to them or passed down to their mothers, and the mothers are passing things down to the children. It's funny how the so-called white man wants to narrate how he empowered the woman, but the men, if they didn't have a mother that was empowering them with assets that was given to her by so-called whites up north, then there was no property that was being distributed. Nothing was free up north when Harriet got up there. Nothing was free. Just a bunch of so-called blacks that were being friendly to her, okay? So Janelle Monáe prepares a bath for Harriet because she tells Harriet that Harriet stinks. All right, Harriet says, I smell funky because that's what running towards freedom smells like. Or she says something about that. She embraced her funk as if it was some type of pride or something. She was proud that she made it up north. Okay. Janelle Monáe says, okay, well, go ahead and wash your ass, get cleaned up, and get you some rest, because tomorrow I'm going to introduce you to your paid job. Okay? Harriet ran up north for what we see today. Today, it's not 2025 just yet, but this is the month of 2025. That's about to be 2025 here in April. Okay? Harriett Tubman ran up north to what we see today. Jobs. All right? Jobs. That was their freedom. Freedom to so-called blacks is jobs and free will. That's freedom. Free will. You can sin and you can work for paper with ink on it and copper-coated zinc. Freedom is nothing compared to salvation. So-called blacks want freedom. They don't want salvation. Salvation is different, okay, from freedom. Salvation and freedom is not the same, okay? This is salvation. Come out of her, my people, that ye may not be partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. Talking about America, Revelations 18 is referring to us, so-called blacks, behind enemy lines here in America. Come out of her, my people. Okay? That ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God have remembered her iniquities. So-called blacks that desire freedom over salvation are in iniquity, okay? Willfully desiring freedom versus willfully going after salvation, working out your salvation, separating from these so-called whites is something that blacks don't strive to do. They don't desire separation. They say it's hate. Y'all preaching that separation doctrine is hate. Y'all just hate white people. You know, matter of fact, so-called blacks believe that so-called whites have been good to them. It's the Most High God that has been bad to them. Okay? So-called blacks will blaspheme the Most High God, Yahweh, for freedom. They'll blaspheme salvation for freedom. This is how stupid they are. You think you free, you are dumb, okay? Hopefully somebody's been edified. This has been a beak with a little bit of content. I don't want freedom. Jobs and Jesus is all these so-called blacks want. This is all they need. Just a little bit of housing and some allowances, and you can re-enslave these so-called blacks. It's not hard to enslave blacks. Freedom was, to me, in my most humble opinion, was another form of slavery. Okay? So again, hopefully somebody's been edified. I want to say shalom. This has been a beak. I want to thank all of my subscribers. I wish all of my subscribers high health and high spirits, and I wish that all of my subscribers' loved ones are safe and protected against these agendas that are waged against us here behind enemy lines. Shalom.